All right, finally got the overhead projector working. Okay, so for today's class, I'm going to try and angle myself this way and just take my mask off so that you can hear a little bit clearer. Feels really weird to do that, but I'm going to try and stay this way. All right, so at the end of last class, after we got through all that sort of utility stuff at the beginning, we got to talking about chapter 1 and where psychology has come from and some of the history involved. And one of the first major problems we talked about was that mind-body problem, where if we're going to be talking about psychology as study of behavior and the mind, we run into this issue where the mind is kind of an intangible thing. And so people have different perspectives on how the mind relates to the body, or if it relates at all. So that's where we had left off, talking about dualism, the idea that the mind and the body are two separate entities, that they have two very separate makeups, that the body is something that you can study, and the mind is something more abstract and unstudyable. And that's problematic for psychology because it says that we can't study the mind, which is half of what our field is. So we really care about our monists, who believe that the mind and the body are one. The mind isn't some separate spiritual entity, but it's more of a connected part of how our body works. So in actually a different of my psychology classes, the textbook uses a really cool analogy to talk about monism. And they compare the mind to the concept of weather. So you can talk about the weather in general, maybe it's cloudy or sunny, but a particular day doesn't have weather as a singular entity. The weather is just a way of talking about the conditions outside. So in the same way, the mind might be sort of a way of describing what's going on in our brains, how things are firing and interacting. And so the mind itself isn't necessarily a singular entity, but it's more of a way of describing what's happening within our bodies, within our brains. So that's more in line with what the monists believed, and that makes it possible for us to say that psychology is something we can study. We can actually learn about the mind by studying the body because it's just sort of an interpretation of what our bodies are doing anyways. So that's where we had kind of left off, was dualism versus monism and why monism is so important for psychology. And we had left with the hint that we'd move briefly into British empiricism. And this is a little bit of a side topic where they were really important pushing that idea of empiricism, that scientific way of looking at things, where you have an empirical view of things, where things are sort of disprovable, where if you had information presented to you, you could say that something isn't happening a particular way. I also try and drill into your heads the fact that in science we tend not to say that something is proven, because we can gather evidence and get more support for a particular theory or idea, but it is very, very difficult to be 100% sure that that's exactly what's going on. Because science is empirical, there is always one piece of evidence that if it was presented to us, would change our theory. And that's the nature of science. It's always going to change and evolve as we start learning more. And so with this British empiricism, this was a movement that was focused on the fact that all of our ideas and knowledge are gained empirically through our senses. As we experience things, that's how we're acquiring knowledge. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later on in the course, but John Locke was a famous philosopher who's very known for his statement of tabula rasa, which literally translates to a blank slate. And so he had this idea that at birth, humans are blank slates. Our minds don't have anything in them, and as we experience our world, we'll start making connections, we'll start learning things through observation. And that's going to lead us into a little bit of behaviorism later on, but that's sort of the start of it here. And there was the extra notion that observation is going to be far more valid than pure reasoning, because reason has the potential for error. And so that statement is very pointedly directed at the previous schools of thought. With both monism and dualism, they did a lot of sitting around and thinking about things. They would reason their way through things. Maybe they were using introspection to think about how they were experiencing the world. Actually, we'll see that in a minute. And those ideas of just considering things isn't necessarily the best way to gather empirical evidence. So a lot of these schools, as you'll find, start arising in contrast to what has existed before. All right, so now we're moving into a little bit more recent history. This is when we move out of philosophy and physiology and more into what we actually call psychology. And I mentioned last time that psychology is a fairly recent field, but psychology-like ideas have been around for centuries. So this is when modern psychology was founded. And again, with a lot of these sort of names and dates, it'll depend on what part of the world you're in, where people agree things have started. But from a North American perspective, you'll usually see Wilhelm Wundt listed as the father of modern psychology. And so he started in the University of Leipzig in Germany in 1867. That's just flavor text. I'm not going to ask you where his lab started or what year or anything like that. But it's kind of interesting to know where and when. And as I said, that's fairly recent in terms of history. If you think of how far back you could go with something like physics or mathematics, they have quite a longer history than psychology does. And with Wundt, his focus was on using scientific techniques to try and study the mind. And he was really pushing to make psychology an independent discipline. He didn't want it to just be a subset of physiology or philosophy or anything like that. He wanted his own standalone scientific field that could rival things like the field of biology. And so there was a big push for a very precise scientific setup and trying to follow as many rules as they could to prove that they were a valid field. And you might find that other fields outside of psychology still have that little bit of a looking down on psychology as a soft science, because when it came around, it was a lot of old white men sitting around thinking about thinking. But we do start introducing more hard scientific reasoning and more rigorous scientific procedures that starts to make it more of a valid field as time goes on. Just a little bit of a background, especially as somebody who started in physics, had friends in chemistry, and moved to biology. There really is a hierarchy among students in each of those schools, and psychology is fairly low on their ladder. But just another fact of interest with Wundt, he had lots and lots of graduate students and colleagues, and they started spreading into Europe and North America. So we have this really interesting little map that's just showing where the first couple of psychology labs spread out in North America. And of course, it's very US-centric, but we do have the University of Toronto all the way back in 1891, which is pretty cool. And again, just for interest's sakes, not necessarily testable. All right, so Wundt and most of his students, though not all, are what we would consider a structuralist. They believed in the perspective of structuralism. And as I said before, a lot of these ideas come up, and then another idea comes up directly opposed. So the same way that we talk about monism and dualism, we're now going to talk about structuralism and functionalism. So a lot of these come up in pairs, and that's going to be a repeating factor we see throughout this course. So these are two schools of thought basically regarding how psychology should work. They're going to fight over what we should focus on, how we should talk about things, and what we should look at in terms of things. So structuralism, as a very basic start, is breaking things down into their elementary components. So look at the individual elements that compose the structure of the mind. whereas functionalism wants to look at the bigger purpose as a whole. So we're looking more at the function or purpose of the overall mind. They don't really care what the mind is made of. They just want to see what it can do, what its functions are. And so we can go a little bit more detailed with both structuralism and functionalism. They get their own slides. So as I said, Wundt was a structuralist, as was Edward Titchener, who's another one of those big names you sometimes see in psychology textbooks. As I mentioned, I don't super focus on names, but I do give them because they are helpful for some people. So Edward Titchener was an English psychologist who actually studied under Wundt for several years. So he was one of Wundt's students and went off and founded his own branch of psychology. And so as structuralists, they were trying to study the mind in terms of basic elements. They wanted to break your consciousness into structural components. And this is where I got a little bit ahead of myself with terminology, and I talked about introspection as a technique that early psychologists use. And it was one of the cornerstones of structuralism. And introspection, though it sounds fancy and maybe professional, was actually just them saying that they are trying to look within to describe their own experiences. So they would sit and they would think about the emotions that they were feeling, the sensations that they were perceiving. And they considered these sensations, the feelings that they noticed, to be the basic elements of consciousness. Now, from a modern perspective, that is very far from scientific. But they were trying to push the idea of systematically collecting records of those feelings, of making note of what they were thinking and how their thoughts were moving, what they were perceiving, and so on and so forth. So they were pushing towards what would become scientific, even if their methods nowadays would be considered very questionable. And so, of course, our contrast is functionalism. So the functionalists thought that the structuralists' minuscule focus on the building blocks perspective completely missed the point. Why would you study the individual elements when what we should care about is what is the mind as a whole? What does the mind do? What is its function? What's its purpose? So they focused on that investigation of purpose and function of our consciousness. So their questions were, what does the mind do, and not what components make up the mind? Now, this is a great place to point out, yet again, that when we have two opposing schools like this, it's a fantastic place for a question that maybe says, hey, this person thinks this about the mind. Are they more of a structuralist or a functionalist, based on their goals or based on their perspectives? So that's a great way to get an application question out of these setups. So we've seen it with monism and dualism, structuralism and functionalism. So that kind of a setup should automatically start ringing bells that this is a good test question. And for how functionalism worked, they rejected that idea of sitting and using introspection. They wanted to push science to be more scientific. And they were heavily influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution. So they were really focusing on how important adaptation was in helping organisms survive and reproduce. So if we're looking at the function of consciousness, the function of the mind, well, it should be doing things that allow us to survive and reproduce if it's evolved to do what it's doing. So they would consider how we interact with things, how we do things, in terms of the function that it serves. So maybe humans are really good at peripheral vision, which we'll talk about in the chapter on sensation and perception. But we have phenomenal perception, even at the edges of our vision. And that's really helpful in terms of, say, avoiding predators. If you can identify a predator off to the side before it's right in front of you, it gives you better survival odds. So that might be something that they'd consider in their functionalist evaluation of consciousness. So just a little bit of a perspective there. And so if we have this sort of fight between functionalists and structuralists, you might wonder, well, who won? And technically neither of them came out completely on top, because psychologists nowadays don't call themselves structuralists or functionalists. Structuralists were useful because they set up that idea of a scientific approach, but their methods of introspection weren't necessarily well accepted. So some of their ideas stuck around and the rest were discarded. But the same way, even with functionalists, that didn't stay exactly as it was either. So you still don't have people who are pure functionalists today, though that sort of way of approaching the world is still seen in quite a few different subjects or subtopics of psychology today. So you can start seeing functionalism in, say, applied psychology and behaviorism, where we still have that focus on adaptive significance and the purpose of how things came to be. So neither of them really won, but we're more on the side of the functionalists than anything. And then that does bring us to our next group, and these are the behaviorists. And so we're starting to get to stuff that's a little bit more close to what we see today. And in fact, there are still behaviorists practicing. I myself would fall under the category of a cognitive behaviorist, because behaviorism is a little too extreme for me. Well, that'll make sense when we talk about some of the subtopics here. So with behaviorism, you're focusing on the environmental control of behavior through learning. So this is the idea that everything that you do, your behavior, your reactions, things that you do to interact with your environment are all driven by stimuli in your environment. And so this sounds kind of like our British empiricists, and there's a pretty direct connection between the empiricists and behaviorism, because there was that focus on your environment sort of triggering your behavior. And so this came up in contrast again to after our structuralists and functionalists were established. And they were saying, no, we're not going to care about the function of the mind. We don't care about the structure of the mind. What we actually care about is explaining behavior. And we're going to explain our behavior by looking at the environment. We're going to look externally. So they radically reoriented psychology as a science of observable behavior only. So they changed that definition of psychology that we've been using, that study of behavior and the mind, and they changed it to just be a scientific study of behavior. They dismissed the mind entirely. That's why I think it's a little extreme. And so they talk about behavior here, and they remove the portion of behavior that we had included to encompass things like thoughts and emotions. For a behaviorist, the definition of behavior is only overt, observable responses or activities. So if you stand up or sit down, you make sounds, you move, those are observable behaviors, that counts. But they don't care what you're thinking, they don't care what's going on internally. All they care is what they can observe, record, and document. So that's a pretty extreme view. And we'll take it even more extreme in just a second when we talk about the radical behaviorists. But for an individual who sort of exemplifies behaviorism, we can look at John B. Watson. And you can see that the times or the dates are getting a little further along. We're sort of the late 1800s, early 1900s at this point. And as I said, this idea and Watson's driving of this behaviorist perspective was major opposition to that mentalism from those earlier schools. They really didn't like structuralism or functionalism. And that's why we've taken such a broad swing here. And they wanted to focus entirely on observable behaviors, nothing with that internal unconsciousness nonsense to them. And so as I said, we can take it another step further, where it's not so much that they don't care about those internal mental processes, but with radical behaviorists like Skinner, they believed that the environment is the only factor. Not only do they not care about the mind, they don't think it affects your behavior at all. So this is a pretty aggressive stance. And if you've ever seen pictures of Skinner, he's a little bit of an intimidating individual. But he was around fairly recently. He did a lot of his work in the 1950s. And he's famous for a quote that says, "No account of what is happening inside the human body, no matter how complete, will explain the origins of human behavior." Basically saying that you could know every inch of the inside of a person's body. You could know exactly what's going through their minds, and it would not help you predict their behavior at all. So that's a pretty intensive statement. And it led to an interesting field that we'll talk about quite a bit in the chapter on learning, because Skinner was the one that started piloting what we now call behavior modification techniques. So when we start talking about operant conditioning, Skinner is going to be massive. But the problem is that Skinner viewed those learning techniques, things that you learn from your environment, as entirely responsible for controlling your behavior, which from a more moderate perspective, we can say isn't probably the whole picture. And this is why I myself go with a softer version of behaviorism. And that leads us into the cognitive revolution. And this is where I fall. So cognitive behaviorism is a little bit of a combination between that behaviorist perspective that the environment drives our behavior, but adding in the cognitive side of things. And pretty much any time you see me talk about cognitive or cognitive perspective, things like that, it's bringing in cognition and thought. Though, I guess another aside here is that the term cognition, or even more controversial theory of mind, is a very quick way to start debates between psychologists of different schools of thought. Even today, there's a very strong, hearty debate about what we can call cognition and not, and how far that goes. But we'll drop little hints of that as we move through some other topics, because I find it interesting to see where that contention arises in modern psychology. So with cognitive behaviorism, we're saying, yes, our learning experiences and our interactions with the environment, all that external stuff is important, but not because it's the only driving factor, because it gives us the information that we need to think about and then act accordingly. So we're adding that extra step where we're aware that the mind is there and it's processing the information that we've gathered from our environment, that we've gathered from learning by interacting with our environment, and then we're making sort of conscious decisions. So it's a little bit more moderate than our extreme behaviorist perspectives. And one of the big names in cognitive behaviorism is Albert Bandura. And I mention him specifically because he was born in Alberta. So he's a local psychological figure. And this cognitive behaviorism actually is still a fairly influential viewpoint today. So that's where I would probably fit in, and that's where a lot of people that I've done research with would also fit in. I do also know a radical behaviorist in the department at the University of Alberta, so they're not completely gone, but for the most part, people tend to be a little bit more moderate, in my experience. All right, and so continuing with this cognitive revolution, our first talk was sort of softening that behaviorist standpoint, but we found a more dramatic shift away from behaviorism into the 1950s and onward. And this was actually driven fairly intensively by the Second World War. And I thought that this was really cool. I'm going to hop ahead to one slide because I think it's really, really cool. So with the World War II, there was a lot of focus on having people go out into the world, having to fight in a war, and maybe not having tons of training. So there was a lot of interest in how the mind worked, how we processed information, how we made decisions, so that they could set up equipment in such a way that somebody with almost no training could intuitively figure it out. And so that's one of the driving factors of this cognitive revolution. So if we look at our cockpit here, the positioning of those dials was something that was specifically designed to be intuitive and easy to understand, even if you had only spent a couple of hours in training, which is kind of cool. So we'll go back a little bit, but we start seeing this shift away from behaviorism towards cognitive perspectives and this idea of thinking and intuition and how we process information. And this also coincided fairly well with the rise of computers. And so there's this long-standing tradition after this point of referring to humans as information processors. We start seeing a lot of terminology carry over from computers, where we have memory, we have internal storage, things like that. So there's a lot of parallels that people drew between how computers work and how the human brain works. So when we talk about sort of things that are held in our working memory, maybe that's the RAM. And maybe if something is in long-term storage, it's a hard drive. And the process of retrieving and storing information is uploading and downloading information to the brain. So we'll start seeing a lot of that sort of stuff as we talk about the structures of the brain. And all of this happening at the same time led to this massive focus on mental states and internal processes. So we started off with things like introspection and considering how the mind was either made up of basic building blocks or how it functioned. And then we went the other way and started looking at the environment only. And then we swing back again to the focus on the mind and how the mind is processing and thinking and what's going on internally, which is a kind of neat swing back. And of course, with this whole movement going on, we find that this cognitive revolution ended after the Second World War was over in the sort of later 1950s as behaviorism started rising again. So because there was so much focus on these cognitive perspectives, the behaviorists who got cast aside when the war started rising back and publishing a lot of papers that sort of directly contradicted some of the cognitive perspective work. And it's a really interesting time. If you ever have some hours to kill, you can look at publications, and they're almost like angry letters written back and forth between behaviorists and cognitive theorists and behaviorists, and they're directly quoting and responding to each other in their rebuttals of theories. So it's almost petty bickering, but it's also very, very famous and influential people doing the bickering. So it's just a fun time for everyone. And so we're going to shift away from, is it sort of cognitive stuff, is it the environment? We're going to look at a different perspective that's still sticking around today, but is also a little bit confrontational, we'll say. So this is the psychodynamic perspective. And throughout this course, anytime you hear psychodynamic, you're going to start thinking Freud. That is the name that should always pop into your head. And Freud is one of those people who everybody talks about, not because any of his work is still used broadly today, but because a lot of what he did was so contentious and so anger-riling that people pushed back very hard. So he's a good person to talk about, not because he was necessarily right, but because he made people mad enough to come up with an alternative, which I think is kind of cool. And so I always give that disclaimer because he has a very controversial background. A lot of his practices are very not great. So it's just good to know that we still talk about him because of the influence on the field as a whole, as opposed to wanting to include what he does as actual psychology nowadays. All right, so the psychodynamic perspective would be considered one of the first major movements in modern clinical psychology. So Freud was focused on people who were trying to deal with what we would now recognize as psychological disorders. At the time, the terminology was a little bit different, but he was focusing specifically on the influence of our unconscious mind on our behavior. So instead of what was going on, like cognitively, what we're actively thinking about, Freud was focused on stuff that we weren't even aware of. And just through pop culture, you probably know a little bit about Freud. As I mentioned in our first class, Freud is sort of that picture that a lot of people have of a psychologist. sitting in a dark room in an armchair with a couch in front of them. And that was very much what he did, was sit with people one-on-one and have them remember things or guide them to remember things, which is where some of the problems come in. And so when he's talking about this unconscious, it's thoughts and memories and desires, things that are below the surface of our consciousness. But he said that even though we weren't aware of them, even though we weren't cognizant of them, they still had a great influence on our behavior. And so this is those hidden things, unknown desires, thoughts that we didn't realize we were having, that sort of thing. So you can kind of start seeing why this was controversial. And so again, we're progressing onward in time. This is coming into the early 1900s. Freud was Austrian, and he founded the psychoanalytic school of thought. So if you see psychoanalytic or psychodynamic, you immediately think Freud. And so he focused a lot on things like free association. So if he says a word, what's the first thing that comes into your mind? Or maybe I start with a word and then you tell me what you think of next and what you think of after that. That would be free association. He also did things like dream analysis, where you would describe your dreams and he would assign connections to your life and to your behavior according to what you dreamed. And so, of course, lots of controversial things, and we were getting away from that push towards being scientific that a lot of psychologists were aiming for at the time. So this was a lot of sitting, talking, and thinking, which is what they wanted to get away from in the beginning. But, as I said, being this controversial and being so different than what everyone else was doing, it led to lots of influence on psychology and how the field looks today. So there are individuals who still practice what we might consider under the umbrella of psychodynamic perspective, but it's very far removed from what Freud did at the time. So modern psychodynamic perspective is going to be a lot more talking about your feelings, talking about how you interact with things from your childhood, but not so much focused on the deep, dark desires and the heavy sexual undertones that Freud tended to stick with. So modern psychodynamic perspective is a little bit less intense. All right, and then our next field, which is another of those very different from the hard sciences that we were looking at to begin with, brings in this idea of humanism and positive psychology. And this was a direct reaction not only to the heavy science, but also to the fact that Freud's perspective was really negative and pessimistic. So Freud focused on sort of unexpressed desires, repressed emotions, childhood trauma, and sexual urges that you weren't acting on. But not everybody thought that everything was that negative. So our humanism and positive psychology focuses more on sort of what is good about people, what can move us forward, and how we can strive to be better individuals. This idea that we're driven not by sort of deep, dark secrets, but by an innate striving to be more and to do better. And so this is very different from behaviorism, looking at behavior being just reactions to the environment, and it's against Freud, where everything's unconscious. Now we're going to focus on the positive aspects of the human condition and our ability to change to achieve the goals that we have in our lives. So there's a huge emphasis on free will, on personal growth, and trying to find meaning in your own existence. So you can try and attain sort of personal enlightenment. And for each of these different schools, we do talk quite a bit about them later on. I think I mentioned in the first class that we're just doing like a Cole's Notes to know what to expect. Because I do find that some of these topics start getting people really interested, and the later chapters line up very nicely with each of these perspectives, which is good to keep in mind. But I did include the two big names for humanism and positive psychology, and these are Maslow and Rogers. So Maslow, if you've heard of him before, you've probably heard about him in regards to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it's a big pyramid where your most basic biological needs are at the bottom, And then at the top is sort of attaining self-enlightenment. And so it goes from you need to have your basic needs met, your biological needs met, then you need to have your safety needs met, and then you can start having other things above that. But if you don't have those basics, it's very hard to become a full human. And again, we'll talk way more about that, but that's just, you may have seen that kicking around. And that's the focus on reaching your individual potential and having self-actualization or achieving your best self as the driving force. So the idea is that everyone is always trying to achieve self-actualization, and we might be held back by missing pieces on that hierarchy of needs. And then in contrast, we had Carl Rogers, who focused very much on person-centered therapy. So instead of, say, the kind of therapy that Freud would do, which was relive your deepest, darkest fears, think about these things, associate that, Rogers focused a lot on listening and supporting people rather than trying to direct them or tell them what to do. So it was a lot of, what do you want to talk about? How does that make you feel? That's where this starts to come in, is Rogers. And he was still focused on the idea of people sort of trying to become better people and being moved by this desire for self-improvement. So that's why these ones are grouped together. And so we can take just a little bit of a detour here and talk about psychology specifically in Canada. And I do this because I find a lot of texts, as I've said, North America tends to be very North America-centric, Europe tends to be very Europe-centric, and so on. But even within North American texts, it is very hard to find stuff about Canada, despite the fact that there are a lot of Canadians who have been very centrally involved in a lot of psychology's development. So when I showed you that graph where we had that one established psychology department of all of, drawing a blank on names, all of once students, there was in 1891 was when they established that one in the University of Toronto, and that was James Mark Baldwin. And again, this is more FYI as opposed to something I'm going to ask you about. I also find it interesting that Baldwin not only established that first psychology lab in Canada, but he was also involved in founding the American Psychological Association. So if you've ever had to write a paper in APA formatting, that is the organization that you can blame for that format. So the American Psychological Association, or APA, they do a lot more than just tell you how to write papers and how to format your citations and stuff like that. They also have rules about ethics, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. They have rules for how you should conduct research, best practices. Basically, you can spend forever on their site, and they have guidelines to do almost everything you need to do as a psychologist, which is kind of cool. And nowadays, I think most of it is available for free, which is much better. I remembered having to pay like $60 for their little book on how to format things, and that was awful. So nowadays, it's much easier. And then a bunch of years later, we got the Canadian equivalent, the Canadian Psychological Association. And I can honestly say I've never really talked about them or seen anything about them because North America is American-centric. So most of what you're going to see is APA as opposed to CPA. But it does exist. And that would probably be something that you'd have to read registrations for and things like that in terms of ethics for work done in Canada. So if you've ever conducted research in Canada, you've probably dealt with them without even realizing it. And for a couple of interesting names, if you're curious about important psychologists who are Canadian, Brenda Milner and Donald Hebb are two very famous Canadians. Brenda Milner is very much loved by those of us who do comparative cognition and things like that. Lots of learning stuff there. So just some interesting names to consider. And I think what I'm going to do is I will call it here because our next couple of slides all come together. And so we'll try and finish up on Friday. And I will remind you again now, because I always forget, Monday is a holiday. Monday is Labor Day, so don't come in on Monday. And I'll try and remember that myself.
Monday the 30th.
Is it?
The 30th? Yeah. It's a new national holiday, the Aboriginals one.
Yeah, that's on,
The 30th of this month.
yes, on Thursday.
Yeah.